This week on The Record, could St. Louis courts hold Kim Gardner in contempt? The circuit attorney faces scrutiny for missing court dates in violent crime cases for the second time in 1 week. Plus, a sigh of relief for the transgender community. How a judge's ruling halted the attorney general's rule that would block trans health care for now. And what those arguments sounded like in court. Tawnya Brown from Vivent Health is on the record. And fresh from a trip overseas, the former U.S. ambassador to Ireland recaps his visit with President Biden. And what is the state of St. Louis? Mayor Tishaura Jones marks the halfway point of her 4-year term and quotes Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s quest for economic justice, what that means for her next 2 years in office as she mounts her re-election campaign. It's all coming up right now on The Record. Welcome to The Record. I'm Mark Maxwell on this Thursday. Thank you for joining us. We have breaking news just into our newsroom moments ago. A judge in the 22nd Judicial Circuit has moved to hold St. Louis Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner in contempt of court. Judge Michael Noble just moments ago moving to hold Kim Gardner and her deputy Chris Desilets in indirect criminal contempt because they failed to show up at a trial in a number of hearings on an armed robbery case on April 10th and April 24th. Both of them will have their right to due process. They can mount their defense. A special prosecutor will take over that indirect criminal contempt hearing on Tuesday, May 30 at 9:30. The judge said this, quote, "The circuit attorney's office appears to be a rudderless ship of chaos. It does not appear that Gardner has made any reasonable efforts to prevent the resulting chaos." The judge goes on to say it appears that Ms. Gardner has complete indifference and a conscious disregard for that judicial process. Felicia Cooper is a relative of Brandon Scott, who was a victim of a violent crime, gunned down in a road rage incident in 2021.
It's like they took the case and put it on the back burner. Like no one thought anything about it until this incident came about where Kim Gardner started getting into trouble. Otherwise, I believe if the incident hadn't came out about Kim, none of this would have ever came to the courts whatsoever. So I honestly believe that since Kim did what she did, then all this came to the light for everyone to know what's exactly going on in Kim's office.
And her office has local county executives and mayors from the surrounding region calling for a city-county merger of the courts and the prosecutor's offices. Top executives in St. Charles, Jefferson, and Franklin County released this statement saying, quote, "We echo St. Louis City Mayor Tishaura Jones and St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell when they said that crime is a regional problem and we need to work together for regional solutions." They go on to say, "We feel this is a very good regional solution. It is important that it preserves local control and allows the voters to choose their prosecutor. While this is outside our jurisdiction, it's a regional issue that affects us all." We caught up with Wesley Bell at the State of the City earlier this week to ask him about the optics and the practicality of some of these issues ongoing. I've got to ask kind of a political question or an optics question. It looked like, I mean, what should the public read anything into the fact that you were a guest of honor seated in the front row and the St. Louis Circuit Attorney was sitting in the back? Just worked out that way?
Not at all. I know that she acknowledged the circuit attorney as well as she acknowledged all of the city officials and regional officials. And I'll say this, one thing about Tishaura and myself, we understand that these issues are regional. We understand that we all have to work together, and absolutely Tishaura is on board, is in line with that.
On a more serious note, how closely do you watch this issue of the Attorney General trying to push the circuit attorney from office? I mean, that's something that would affect a position like yours, if it could.
You know, one thing that I've learned in this job is that it's hard enough to do it as is, and so I don't comment on what other offices are doing. Now, we're there to support them when we can, but as far as commenting on those challenges, I think that's best for that office holder.
We asked Wesley Bell for a direct response to that call from regional leaders about merging the offices. His office has declined to issue an official response to that specific request. Meanwhile, Missouri's Attorney General Andrew Bailey lost his first round in court just yesterday as he fights to block transgender health care across the state for minors and adults. A court temporarily halted his order from going into effect on midnight of last night, but the judge did give Bailey until Monday to file arguments in defense of his rule. No one from the Attorney General's office showed up in person in court yesterday, but the Solicitor General, Josh Devine, did show up virtually to argue for blocking children and adults from transgender medication or operations. in court. Transgender advocates were there and reacted to the court arguments from just outside. But in moments like these, when politics often points its scrutinizing spotlight at issues in the doctor's office or in clinics, we like to try and dig in to understand how the political debate can impact people in real life. So helping us do that today is the Vice President of Vivent Health, Tawnya Brown, is on the record. We're glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
For people in our audience who may not be familiar with your organization, can you just give us a brief overview of the kind of work you do?
Yeah. So Vivant Health operates what we call an HIV medical home model of care. What we're seeking to do is to provide integrated care for people living with HIV. We offer pharmacy, medical, dental, behavioral health, case management, food pantry services for people with HIV, and HIV testing.
For decades now, I understand.
Yes, yes.
And going back to the 1980s, the world of politics, it was a very different time politically, but politics played a role in the rhetoric and the public's understanding around HIV then, did it not?
Absolutely. And it was always grassroots people on the ground living the life, helping people who created these organizations that like Vivant Health.
I understand you weren't in the courtroom but had some briefings from lawyers who were just yesterday. What was your first blush reaction to the rhetoric in the courtroom, the arguments, and the outcome? We know it's not a permanent outcome yet, but what was your first reaction?
Yeah, my first reaction was, and then the fight needs to continue because there's a belief by the Attorney General's office that there's medical consensus around limiting access to gender-affirming care when it's actually the opposite. And so we need this rule to go away as soon as possible.
I want to ask some questions because a lot of people who tune into this program do so for political reasons. They want to see what the political discussions are, and many of them may be newer to this topic, or they may be trying to understand or work their way through it. Our hope is that the process of debate and learning helps people understand each other. Attorneys for the ACLU and for clinics and hospitals that were trying to block this rule, they made this quote: "It's hard to make medical decisions for other people when you're not a physician," referring to the Attorney General there. But states do set some regulations around medicine and malpractice and liability. Is there some room for that here?
There would be room for it if it were actually based on input from the medical community. This is not. The consensus from medical groups, national medical groups, is that access to gender-affirming care is part of what is helpful for people's mental health when they have gender dysphoria. And what we've got is kind of an opposite situation where please prove that you need this care, and the care is actually part of what relieves the mental health issues that people with gender dysphoria experience.
So we'll start with some definitions of the rule, and then we'll try to get into some definitions of some of the treatments and see if we can understand part of what the discussion is all about here. So the Attorney General would have any patient, whether they're minor or adult, go through 18 months of what his attorneys in court yesterday called talk therapy. Is it true or false that patients seeking gender transition care already undergo counseling or therapy of some kind?
Yeah. So counseling or therapy is definitely part of how someone prepares for a gender transition in their affirming care process. When people are making these decisions, there seems to be an expectation that this is just something they thought of today, and then they go to the doctor and get on these hormones. That's not how it works. They've been dealing with these issues for their lives and have been in and out of mental health therapy for quite some time, often.
So at the end of that 18 months, should the Attorney General's rule go into effect after 18 months of this? And the lawyer was quite clear. He didn't want this to be an either or. He wanted the talk therapy to result in talking the person out of undergoing their gender transition. He said, don't let them get on this train, he called it, that would lead to regret. That was the rhetoric. What did you make of that comment?
To me, it just shows a fundamental lack of understanding of what's actually happening in people's lives who are facing this issue. People need to have this done so that they can feel and their gender match who they are. There isn't a talking them out of it. They feel this, they believe this about themselves just as well as cisgender people like me believe that I am a woman, right? And so there is no talking them out of it. That isn't a thing.
Is it true or false that there are more people undergoing gender transition procedures or cross-sex hormones or today than maybe there was a decade ago?
Sure.
Why is that?
You know, I think part of what's happened is the medical consensus has moved in this direction, not away from it, as the Attorney General would have us believe. And so as we become more aware of how important access to gender-affirming care is, and as stigma has been relieved to some extent around some of these issues, more of the people who need access to this care have sought it.
There was one comment from an attorney as well who said that this was, I believe, the ACLU saying that, quote, there is no democratic process to give deference to because this wasn't a law, this is an Attorney General's rule. Quote, unlike a statute, this rule is not the result of the democratic process. But as you well know, lawmakers in Missouri would love to do that. There are a number of them who want to debate this, pass it into law. So if they do, when they do, how would you describe is it true that right now a patient could walk into a clinic or a hospital, seek this sort of gender affirming care with no regulations around it at all, or are there already some?
Yeah, so, you know, a physician isn't going to willy-nilly prescribe anything, right? They're going to do a medical assessment, get a history, understand where a person is before they prescribe any medication, and gender affirming care is no different.
Right, and there are some claims. So in their argument, the Attorney General said none of these treatments are approved by the FDA. True or false?
Medical consensus is the use of these drugs for this purpose for decades. Now, were they approved specifically for this purpose? I'm not a physician, I'm not going to speak on that.
Should the FDA put its stamp of approval on this kind of treatment?
That would certainly make this easier, because the medical consensus clearly affirms it. Medical associations clearly affirm it. If the stickler is that the FDA hasn't approved it, they certainly should.
So at the end of this 18-month barrier or required talk therapy the AG wants people to go through, he says after that point there's a second hurdle you'd have to clear, which is to have a doctor sign off and say there are no other underlying mental health conditions. The lawyers that are trying to kill this rule in court said, well, wait a minute, what if a patient has ADHD, or what if a patient has a nicotine addiction, or what if a patient has depression because they want to go through this treatment, and the only way to cure the depression is to go through the treatment, and the door is still closed to them. I want to ask you about a different question, though. Can there be people who go through this process that don't have? It seems like there's an insinuation here in that claim alone, that anybody who's wanting to do this, they must have some mental health disorder. That seems to be the rhetoric.
Yeah, and I guess my question back would be, first of all, what's wrong with that? Why are we stigmatizing mental illness? I have depression. Many of us are going to experience challenges with our mental health over the course of our lives. This notion that people should be mental illness free before they can make a medical decision about what to do with their own body is ridiculous.
Where do you see this going from here? We understand it could go all the way to trial. The legislature could step in. There's a number of ways this could shake out. Let me ask this question, just lastly, because I understand the politics here, and people are still learning a lot. I think science and medicine are still learning around these issues, if we're being frank. Can there be a state interest when it comes to children and minors? Because the state sets interests and age limits and all kinds of things, from drinking to getting a tattoo. This is a very personal thing, a person's identity. Can there be a government or a state interest when it comes to the age limits?
You know, what I would say to that is, can we do that with informed decision making by including the people that are experts in this area? And I don't believe that that's what has happened. Parents are making those decisions on behalf of their children, who they live with, they know what they're experiencing, and in coordination with their physicians, they should be allowed to make that decision. If we're going to revisit that, it better be with evidence.
Tawnya Brown from Vivent Health, thank you for helping us understand a complex and emerging issue.
Thank you.
President Joe Biden officially relaunched his campaign, his bid for re-election earlier this week, just days after returning from his ancestral homeland of Ireland. St. Louis native and former U.S. ambassador to Ireland, Kevin OMalley, traveled with the president on that trip. Ambassador OMalley joined us on the record in KSTK's Studio B earlier this afternoon. Former ambassador to Ireland, Kevin OMalley, joins us now, and we're glad to have you with us. Welcome back. It's been a few days now since you've returned from Ireland.
Great to be here.
We're glad to have you. Was it more diplomacy or sightseeing?
I think it was a combination of diplomacy and in the north, and a different kind of diplomacy in the south. Anytime the president goes anywhere, it's diplomatic. I mean, he is increasing the stature of our country in the a very good friend of ours.
How do you describe to people who are new or curious about the sectarian or the regional divides in Ireland that exist there, and people that might read about Brexit and the economic spillover, the ripple effect there? Is there some part of their local or domestic politics that might affect us here?
No, it won't affect us directly, but many Americans, over 30 million Americans, identify as having some degree of Irish ancestry, so they're concerned about what happens in Ireland. But it is really a domestic issue between warring factions, now just disagreeing factions in the north of Ireland, which have spilled over sometimes into the Republic and into the United Kingdom.
There's a lot of talk about the treaty that was signed there some time ago, and there's sort of this peace of some kind. Are there lessons that Americans can learn? We have a lot of our own political divisions and cross sections of the country. Are there things that they've done well in Ireland that we can learn from? Are there lessons that we can avoid?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why the president wasn't trying to pitch an American solution to the celebration of the Good Friday agreements, which are now 25 years old. But what we could learn from them is compromise. To get the peace for the people, for the Protestants to stop killing the Catholics and the Catholics to stop killing the Protestants, they had to compromise. They each had strong positions, but they compromised those positions for a greater good, and that was peace.
And do you describe it as more political, more religious? And you mentioned the peace from actual violence was sort. A lot of people look at our country now in the divisions and say that's a direction where we could head if we're not careful.
Absolutely, that's exactly the direction we are heading. But I would characterize it as not religious or political, but it was economic. For historic reasons, the majority in Northern Ireland, who happened to be Protestants at the time, had all of the economic advantages and held it against the Catholics, who were the minority. And that's all changed now. There are more Catholics in Northern Ireland than Protestants, and people have grown tired of the violence, and that's why they were able to compromise. With the help of the United States, were able to reach a compromise and stop the violence 25 years ago, and that's held, and that's one of the things that the president wanted to celebrate, was the fact that they have made some progress. They still have more to go, but they've made progress.
Something about sharing conveys dignity to the other party. It says you're worthy of my goods, time, whatever that is. We've heard historians or political commentators say any society that has ever failed has done so because they stopped learning how to share.
Without doubt. I mean, the whole book, the premise, How Democracies Die, is based upon that premise, that everybody stood by their principles, and as a result of that, the democracy withered. And what we have to learn how to do is compromise, and that's one of the, it wasn't stated directly, but that's one of the things that the president wanted to accomplish.
I could dive in and ask you a whole host of questions about your time as ambassador to Ireland. President Obama appointed you there, and then your work volunteering with the Biden campaign. But I want to shift because I think a lot of people in our audience that watch this program do so because they're curious about politics. And they saw the news this week that President Biden is launching his re-election bid. You spent a lot of time around the president, maybe not in his direct inner circle, but you were there. How would you describe his energy level?
I would say it's hard to keep up with. The president's schedule, and for this particular trip, we were with him. It was a very small delegation of about 10 people. We're with him almost every moment. We left, and started out early in the morning, and we ended oftentimes after midnight. And the president was on his feet, working and engaged almost every minute of that time. And I would say that those of us involved in the delegation were pretty exhausted at the end of the trip, and he worked much harder than we did. I make room for the fact that some people may say that President Biden is too liberal or he's too conservative on policy issues. I get that. But anyone who's spent any amount of time with him would not question his ability, his energy, and his mental capability.
Do you have a sense of his view or the view of his aides about whether or not he flinches at this question? Does he see it as ageist to ask about his capacity? Look, my grandfather's 83, and he's dialing his schedule back a little bit. He wants to take a few less risks and have a little more relaxation in his life. Is it fair for Democratic primary voters or for the country at large to ask the question, will Joe Biden in 2028 be the same Joe Biden as he is in 2023?
Well, in a democracy, all questions are fair. And I think the president has said that he thinks it is a fair question to ask. But it's a question to ask with an open mind. And so when you see the evidence of his abilities and his stamina, then I think it is ageist to say, well, that's a number and therefore you can't cross that number. You know, it's different for many people, and he has the ability to withstand the pressures of the office.
Should the Democratic Party allow, facilitate, encourage debates?
I mean, in a
primary process?
I don't. I think we're too far away to probably predict that, but my guess is no. I don't think that the president would shy away from it, but I don't see what.
Then why not?
I don't know what a purpose it would accomplish, other than it would produce some television for people to watch. But
well, I mean, I happen to be in that industry.
I understand that, but other than if we take your bias out of it, I just don't know that it accomplishes anything, because clearly he will be the nominee.
You think that's the case? If he runs, even if he were to be challenged, there's nobody that could top him in the party.
Can you name anybody?
I think there are a number of people who have suggested they won't challenge him, but that's the larger question is he the best fit? Say the Republicans don't nominate someone like Donald Trump and they go a younger route for a Ron DeSantis or a Mike Pence or a Nikki Haley. Does that contrast start to lose some of its luster?
Well, I think that you're comparing age to age on that,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that the president would suggest perhaps that we look at the record of what he's accomplished in the last couple of years. And I think he's very comfortable running on that, and I'm very comfortable supporting him on that.
We're running low on time. I wish I could ask you a lot more questions. We're very glad to have a St. Louisan who was on a recent trip with the president overseas to Ireland for some of your perspective. Thanks for joining us.
Good, my pleasure.
The ambassador said to look at the record. Oh, we're going to do that. That's enough about presidential politics. After all, there is a book that says, what if mayors ruled the world? I don't know if Mayor Jones wants to rule the world, but she does want to rule St. Louis for another 4 years after this first term. She delivered her State of the City address this Tuesday night, marking a recent reduction in violent crime, pledging progress in faster, more efficient government, but also sought to buy some time to deliver on those promises, asking voters to recalibrate their expectations about any return to the glory days.
The 1-2 punch of a shrinking workforce and COVID-19 put a strain on our city's overstretched workforce and our antiquated hiring system. We can't go back to the so-called golden era of St. Louis. Leaving the past behind hurts, but we also need to recognize that the St. Louis of the past didn't work for everyone. It never worked for people who look like me, and in many cases, it still doesn't. The kind of long-term transformative change we're working on doesn't happen overnight, because St. Louis didn't get like this overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day, and while I'm black girl magic, it doesn't come with a wand or a cape, even though I'm wearing one tonight. The changes we desire, a safer, stronger St. Louis, won't happen in 1 year or in one term.
If the mayor is going to secure a second term to carry out her long-term vision, she may have to stave off challengers like Alderwoman Kara Spencer. Spencer has not said she will run, only that she's mulling the possibility. She was one of 6 members of the Board of Aldermen not to show up at the mayor's speech this week and said this afterwards. Quote, "I was dismayed to hear the mayor say we can't go back to the golden era of St. Louis. We certainly have our challenges, but our history, cultural assets, and location on the nation's largest river are second to none." Spencer says we have phenomenal partners in the community, and together with the right vision and commitment to excellence, we absolutely can be a world-class city once again. And before we go, we have to correct the record. Late Tuesday night, I was clacking away on my keyboard reporting a story about that State of the City address and writing in particular about the Republican reaction to it. There's a House Republican by the name of Brad Christ in our area who delivered what he called an official response to the State of the City address. In that video, he referred to himself as a St. Louisan, but he also said that he represented parts of St. Louis County in his district, so I wanted to be sure he was from St. Louis. I went to his official legislative bio at the Missouri House of Representatives, and there it was, hometown, St. Louis. He says he was born in St. Louis on that same page farther down and resides there today. So I just wanted to double check again. I wanted to be extra certain. I went and checked his campaign registration documents at the Missouri Ethics Commission. You see there the residence, St. Louis, once. There it is again, twice. So in the first draft of our story, which we've since corrected, I reported that Brad Christ was from South City. And the blowback on Twitter was fierce. First, it was from the mayor's own dad, Vervis Jones, telling me, quote, "You clearly need a geography lesson." And I did get one. Then aides to Rep. Christ piled on. We got from the left and the right. Yikes. Not exactly Pulitzer material here, one said. Another chimed in saying, "Intrepid reporting." All right, message received. After further review, I learned that Rep. Christ does indeed live outside of the city limits, just south of the city lines in Sappington. That's apparently an unincorporated part of St. Louis County. So if I wanted to send a letter to Sappington, is this the only part of the country where I would write that to St. Louis and it would get there somehow? I guess I'm the one who's supposed to be confused with this process. The whole episode, though, was a bit of a reminder for us, yes, to be careful with facts. Every little thing does matter, and we want to make sure that we get those things right. So I do stand corrected as we correct the record here. But the whole episode, in my observation, was also a microcosm of so much of the paralyzing and poisonous politics that exists on Twitter and sometimes in our corner of Missouri. Some folks dismiss the criticism out of hand from Representative Christ because, after all, you're not from here. You can't have anything positive to say. In other words, this is the way we've always done it, whether with our zip codes or with our policies, and outsiders or newcomers aren't welcome. I was blown away at just how quickly the whole conversation jumped off the rails entirely from the speech itself, the substance of the debate. No longer were we discussing the best ways to rebuild our shrinking city. We were now bickering about who belongs and who doesn't. What better way to add than to subtract? This sort of ostrich's head in the sand approach not only cuts ourselves off from bright ideas or lessons that we might learn from other parts of the country or the region, but it sends the wrong message to people who move here, who work here, who may want to stay here a while. We invited Representative Christ to sort through his response and speech. Unfortunately, it wasn't going to work out with his schedule this week. Maybe another time soon. We'll be back at the same time next week. Until then, we're off the record.